I would now like to be honored to welcome and introduce Vicky Smallman and Marjorie Emmanuel as our speakers for today's Policy Matter session. Vicky Smallman is a National Director of the Human Rights Department for the Canadian Labour Congress, CLC. A longtime activist on gender equality and human rights issues, Vicky spent more than a decade in academic labor movement, working primarily with contract academic staff before joining the CLC in 2010. She leads a team of responsible for the labor movement's policy and advocacy and campaign work on women's and human rights, anti-racism, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and Indigenous and disability justice. Vicky is a community research associate at Western University Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. She has researched and written about academic labor issues, activism, and women in Canadian politics. Marjorie Emmanuel, Women and Gender Equality Canada Director, International Intergovernmental Relations. Boasts on distinguished and extensive career in public service, marked by a deep commitment to leadership and diversity and policy innovation. For the past 2 years, she has been serving as a director at Women and Gender Equality Canada, where she's responsible for steering the organization's international and intergovernment initiatives. In this role, Marjorie has played a key part in advancing Canada's efforts to promote gender equality on the global stage. Before her current position, Marjorie made significant contributions at Canadian Heritage, where she led the multiculturalism policy team within the multiculturalism and anti-racism branch. Over the course of her nearly 23 years in the public service, she has held a wide range of senior roles, including Chief of Staff to an Assistant Deputy Minister and leadership positions in human resources, international bilateral relations, and travelers policy. Her extensive experience spans several key federal departments, with most of her career spent at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, IRCC, and the Canadian Border Services, CBSA. Marjorie holds a bachelor's degree in social science with a concentration in sociology from the University of Ottawa. Outside of her role professional life, she's a proud soccer mom to 2 teenagers. I'll now pass it to Catalina to moderate the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Ms. Gahn, and thank you so much, Vicky and Marjorie, for joining us. So I have a few questions here, and then I'll open it up to the group to see if they have any questions for you as well. But my first question is for both of you, and I was wondering if you could briefly speak to how the BPfA has been implemented in Canada over the past several years.
Maybe I'll start. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm actually really pleased to be joining with Vicky, who has way more experience than I do, so that makes me very comfortable. And going through the Kahoot test, I was wondering maybe Adrienne should be doing this presentation. So on the history of the Beijing Declaration and the Government Canada's role. So I'm not going to go too much into the history because I know you've had that before. But as you know, the Fourth World Conference for Women, as known as the Beijing Conference in 1995, is both a milestone and really a turning point for the global agenda for gender equality around the world. From this conference emerged the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, which, along with the Convention of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, so CEDAW, is a central international policy document for the promotion of gender equality in Canada, as well as throughout the world. The Beijing Declaration calls for strategic action in 12 critical areas of concern, which included women in poverty, women in the economy, women in the media, etc. It's not surprising that Canada joined the consensus in adopting the Beijing Declaration, as we were actively involved in the development of those critical areas of concern. In fact, in preparation for the Beijing conference, the Government of Canada developed an action plan. So it was called Setting the Stage for the Next Century, the Federal Plan for Gender Equality, 1995 to 2000, which outlined Canada's commitments to gender equality. The plan's objective considered the principal areas of critical concern outlined in the Beijing Platform for Action, which were still in draft form. They included the implementation of gender-based analysis throughout federal departments, improving women's economic autonomy, reducing violence in societies, particularly violence against women and children, promoting gender equality in all aspects of Canada's cultural life, incorporating women's perspectives in governance, promoting and supporting global gender equality, and advancing gender equality for employees of federal departments and agencies. Interestingly, all of these areas of concerns continue to be important gender equality issues 30 years later. 4 years after the Beijing conference, the 23rd special session of the General Assembly took place at the UN headquarters in June 2000, and the political declaration outcomes document was adopted at this session. In line with the special session and the 5-year anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, the Government of Canada adopted a new action plan in 2000. The Agenda for Gender Equality, a 5-year government-wide strategy to engender policy and program initiatives within a new policy framework, accelerate the implementation of the gender-based analysis tool, enhance voluntary sector capacity, including funding for new organizations and for the purpose of addressing new and emerging issues, engaging Canadians in the policy process, as well as meeting Canada's international commitments. In 2004, as part of the strategy, the Standing Committee on the Status of Women was established in the House of Commons by agreement on all political parties. For Beijing plus 10, the UN Economic and Social Council, so the ECOSOC, decided that a high-level meeting was needed for the participation of all UN members on the implementation of the Beijing Declaration. And from that moment, the UNCSW became the official review process for the Beijing plus, for Beijing. So for Beijing plus 15 and Beijing plus 20 in 2010 and 2015, they both followed a similar process, high-level review of the implementation, work on UNCSW's session contribution to ECOSOC's annual ministerial review, as well as the adoption of the record for UNCSW and the agenda for the following years. Beijing plus 25, so in 2020, that of course was a special year, and it was only one day, which included an opening statement as well as the adoption for the political declaration. So over the years, Canada's implementation for the declaration has varied in approach and can be seen in Canada's national reviews. From 2005 to 2015, Canada had a new approach for gender equality and the implementation of the Beijing Declaration. During this time, the focus was more on the integration of gender equality in the priorities of the government. This aligned with the Government of Canada's tabling of the Departmental Action Plan on Gender-Based Analysis in 2009, which provided a blueprint for increasing accountability for the application of GBA, which now includes a plus across the federal government. The plus serves to highlight intersectional factors of diversity into gender-based analysis. As a result, this period saw significant progress in the adoption of the GBA plus across the federal government. In 2015, after Beijing plus 20, so UNCSW, the government's policy approach shifted to an ambitious feminist agenda. This included the appointment of the first balanced federal budget, the creation of the first department dedicated to the advancement of women and gender equality, the release of the first federal gender budget statement that examined gender effects of all budget measures, as well as the first federal strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. In November 2015, the first ever full Minister of Women and Gender Equality, as opposed to just the Status of Women agency, was appointed, demonstrating the government's strong commitment to ensuring that gender and diversity considerations are brought to the cabinet table. The federal government's budget in 2018 included the first comprehensive gender chapter. The Government of Canada has also enacted significant legislation since 2015. A few is the Canadian Gender Budgeting Act, as well as the Department for Women and Gender Equality Canada, which is an act that was integrated in about 2018, which we'll talk about a bit later. That's it for now.
Great, thank you so much.
That was
and
a
then
lot.
Maybe I'll pass it over to Vicky.
Sure. So yeah, it's an interesting, so implementation of Beijing, it's the Beijing Platform for Action is a very aspirational document. And it's important to recognize that there's no country in the world that has successfully implemented it fully. And there's always a push-pull, depending on who's in government and that type of thing. I would say that in Canada, we've made progress in some areas, and we have either stayed status quo or possibly taken a few steps backward in other areas. So what happens when a Beijing review year comes around from the civil society perspective is the organizations that sort of keep an eye on Beijing and participate in the UN Commission on the Status of Women every year get together, and we write a parallel report. We write our own report on Canada's progress in the 12 critical areas of the Beijing Platform for Action. We add a few chapters to talk about emerging issues, for example, and so on. And in recent years, we've added recent review years. We've added chapters examining specific challenges facing specific groups of women, for example, Indigenous women or Black women or women with disabilities. And it is a very collaborative project. For the first year, well, after Beijing +5, I believe, so initially, I should actually go back a little bit more. Sorry. When Beijing happened, so Beijing was not just a government process. It was governments and civil society sort of working together. So that, was very complex kind of conference, which led to the development and the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And civil society was very much kind of embedded in that. And Canadian civil society, we had a steering committee at the time made of national women's organizations and a number of, and there was a process by which a number of women from various types of groups, including the labor movement, but other types of organizations as well, went to Beijing in order to participate in the discussions. And then they came back, and after the 5th year, I think, after the first review, the Feminist Alliance for International Action was founded, and they did the first couple of parallel reports. So in 2010 and I believe in 2015, if I recall, 2015 we may have actually moved over to CCPA. FIAP, was sort of the organization that brought us together to focus on implementation. And then in 2015, FIAP experienced a bit of a contraction of funding, shall we say, and so the person who was initially responsible for doing that moved over to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and they, along with the Canadian Labour Congress and other groups, collaborated on the next parallel report. And it's sort of that evolved into that group of organizations working on the parallel report established kind of the Beijing network, or the Beijing 25 network. So we started it officially on the 25th anniversary. Now we're the Beijing 30 network, and it is about 70 or so, mostly national, but some regional or feminist and equality seeking organizations. And we essentially divvy up the task. People are tapped to write particular chapters looking at how we've done in the various critical areas of concern and so on. And so that came out, our most recent one, and we only look at the last 5 years because that's how the review process works. You only look at what's happened in the last 5 years. So Marjorie's done a good job at laying out some of the areas of progress in the last 5. I would say that despite the pandemic, we have been able to, which was a huge setback for women, right? We have been able to make some real progress. I would say the COVID response itself was hugely powerful for a lot of women, that the access to the CERB and other types of supports that were available at the time was extremely meaningful, as well as the funding specific to shelters and sexual assault centers, hugely instrumental. But the big kind of things that have happened is the groundbreaking commitment of long-term funding for childcare. So the building blocks of a universal publicly funded childcare system, the introduction of the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, which was a long demand, and the first federal 2S LGBTQI action plan also, and pharmacare, with its coverage of contraception and diabetes treatments, is going to help us make more progress towards sexual and reproductive health and rights. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done. I would say that, despite some progress, we still see huge, not really any meaningful movement in the gender wage cap, and particularly the situation for Indigenous women. For example, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, the disproportionate amount of violence that they experience. So there's areas where, despite attempts, we've not really been able to break through a lot of systemic barriers. So we have the appearance of action without a lot of movement, which is why it's important to have civil society review, because it really helps offer a critical lens on the progress and some ideas for moving forward. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure we'll get more into it.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. And then, so going to our second question, I have the same question, but I'll be asking it in the context that you both work in. So maybe I'll switch back to Marjorie. And I know you touched on this a little bit in your answer already, but what is the role that Women and Gender Equality Canada plays in the implementation of the BPfA?
So Wages' role started way before Beijing, before the department even existed in 1995, the Office of the Coordinator of the Status of Women, also known as Status of Women Canada, held the responsibility for gender equality across the Government of Canada. Status of Women in Canada was established by the Privy Council in 1970. And over the years, the agency's responsibilities included providing strategic policy advice, administering the Women's Program and the Gender-Based Violence Program, and supporting and leading the implementation of the GBA+, and promoting commemorative events related to women. The first minister for the status of women was appointed a year later in 1971. And interestingly, the first woman minister was appointed 10 years later. Judy Irola was appointed in 1981. So for over 40 years, Status of Women Canada as a federal agency was responsible for coordinating policy related to the status of women and administering programs related to advancing gender equality. And then in 2018, when our department was created, new legislation transformed the agency into Women and Gender Equality Canada, aka WAGE. So Canada's first standalone department dedicated to advancing gender equality. Under the expanded mandate, WAGE advances gender equality, including economic, social, and political equality, respects to sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity and expression. It promotes a greater understanding of intersectional of sex and gender with other identities. So at this point, the coordination and review and implementation of the Beijing fell to WAGE just in time for Canada to develop its national review for Beijing +25. One notable shift in 2018 was that the Canada now officially considered women in all their diversity in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, so including those who are part of the 2S LGBTQI+ community. In the implementation of the Beijing Declaration, WAGE's official role as convener, knowledge broker, and capacity builder looks to advance gender equality. WAGE leads the Beijing-related activities such as monitoring, reviewing, and reporting Canada's progress on the Beijing Declaration, sharing knowledge and coordinating with other government departments, and providing support through programs that build organizations' capacity to address systemic barriers. In the implementation of Beijing, we also must remember that Canada is also a federated state. comprised, of course, of 10 provinces and 3 territories who have their own specific responsibilities related to advancing gender equality. Because of this, different aspects of the Beijing Declaration fall into different levels of government of Canada. So in advancing gender equality requires all levels of government to work together. So the formal channel for gender-focused FPT collaboration is the Federal Provincial Territorial Forum for Ministers responsible for the status of women. Through this forum, the ministers responsible for status of women meet each year since 1982 to cooperate on policy questions, raise awareness of women's and girls' issues, as well as provide leadership in promoting gender equality. In addition to the PTs, WAGE also works with the national Indigenous leaders and representatives to help inform policies and programs that affect Indigenous women and girls. For Canada's Beijing Plus 30 National Review, WAGE met with the national Indigenous leaders to advise them on the progress and challenges that have been seen over the past 5 years. I'll let Vicky talk about the role of Canadian civil society, and she already has, in terms of the review. However, I will say that WAGE works in partnership with them, in particular providing funding to them in the efforts towards our shared equality goals. For example, this year, WAGE provided funding to the Beijing Network, so FIAP, to develop an independent and parallel shadow report of the Beijing Plus 30 report. Turn it over to Vicky to talk about the civil society role.
Okay, do you want me just to continue? Yep. So civil society, I mean, our role really, as you know, is to have that independent analysis, interpretation, to apply some pressure to, to hold governments accountable, to speak truth to power. Those are all of the things that we do. And for us, it's a really important process to be able to every 5 years sit down and take a look at what we need to do. I will say that there's that this year it is the first year we've had direct funding to support our parallel report, which really made a big difference, to be honest, in allowing us to get it done quickly, and to be able to compensate people who provided us with some of the chapters, and to pay for translation, which is always a struggle with civil society organizations that are sort of operating on a shoestring. Most years we've done this off the sides of desks, right? And so having access to WAGE funding has been very helpful to that process. And WAGE has supported the Beijing network in Beijing Plus 25 as well. Unfortunately, what we had envisioned for that was to be able to send people to Paris and Mexico for the Generation Equality Forum, and then COVID happened, and we had to sort of pivot to do some other things. But for us, it is, like the network provides a convening role to basically allow civil society, a feminist and equality seeking civil society in all of its diversity, to share, to collaborate, to network, and so on, and then to hopefully engage and play a role in either in the development of the Canada's National Review. I would say we're not quite there yet, which is why the parallel process is so important, or to engage. Like, this is the first. Having the review is one thing, but then helping to identify priorities for the global discussions that will happen at the UNCSW is another. Then there's the whole process of, like, how are we monitoring and accounting for things at home aside from the Beijing review process. And I would say that we still have a long way to go in Canada around meaningful engagement on a regular basis, just on the various, and Marjorie is exactly right. Like, this is a whole of government, multi-jurisdictional process, right? And so it's important for civil society to be engaged throughout. The challenges with feminist civil society in Canada, especially domestic-facing feminist civil society, is that most organizations don't have the funding or the capacity to do a lot of research, policy analysis, and advocacy. A lot of that stuff gets done off the sides of desks, which is why collaborating has been so important to us over the years. But I would say that, you know, in the last 5 years, actually in the last almost 10 years, it's been, we've definitely been engaged a lot. I think, though, that there's room for improvement always in how we do things.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think your answers were like super complimentary. So it's really interesting to see like how wage and civil society interact when it comes to the BPfA. So my next question is for both of you, and it speaks again like very wholly related to the things that you've kind of talked about already. But we were wondering a little bit about, you know, what are the avenues for youth to be involved in the implementation of the BPfA, both nationally and internationally, and maybe on the like government and non-governmental side?
Vicky, can I turn to you first on this one?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's lots of different ways that youth can be involved, right? You know, within the sort of the UN universe, right? Youth-led organizations and organizations representing and working with youth, including adolescents and you know, girls, do play a really important role. And over the last little while, there have been very specific youth gatherings at the CSW, and there have been real efforts, self-organized for the most part, I will say, by young people involved in different organizations globally to collaborate, to come up with you know, sort of guiding documents, manifestos. You know, they had a manifesto for the Beijing Plus 25, and I know that that youth are organizing for Beijing Plus 30 as well. You know, having a distinct voice within that broader civil society, and it is really important because I think when we think about some of the big challenges in the world right now between conflict and like climate change, that eye on the future has to be paramount, right? Because we're doing this work for future generations. And so the voices of young people and young people sort of speaking and articulating for themselves is really important. I will say that there have always been barriers in Canadian sort of civil society around youth engagement. There are some organizations that do a really good job, but there isn't one national umbrella sort of group that brings young voices together. There are a lot of really good, but there are also a lot of organizations that have put an emphasis on bringing young leaders to these spaces. So the YWCA, for example, really puts an emphasis on bringing young leaders to the CSW every year and engaging them. And there's other examples as well. I would say that self-organizing and claiming your space is one tactic. Trying to get involved in any organization is another. There's a big generational change happening right now in Canadian civil society, where we have a lot of people retiring and moving on. There will be a shift. The only problem is that there's not a lot of money for jobs. So it is very hard to be a professional feminist, right? The jobs are few and far between. But whatever way that you can, you know, get involved in the conversation, and there's so many different ways, I would just encourage people to try and do so. And then we have to remember that implementing the BFA isn't about going to the CSW, right? Or even reviewing it. It's about the hard work of doing feminism at home. And that means like getting involved, running for elections, you know, getting involved politically, getting involved in, various types of advocacy, whether it's for healthcare, reproductive rights, education and training, decent work. Getting involved in the labor movement, for example, has been my vehicle, right? And there's probably you're already doing some of that work right now, right? It's just not being framed that way.
I'm happy I let Vicky go first because a lot of the things that she said, I was about to say. The only thing I would maybe add in terms of getting involved in it, these are things that you already know because you're activists in all your own ways, but using your distinct voice and using your digital voice, so digital activism. So Canadian youth can leverage digital platforms to raise awareness around the BFIA and advocate for gender equality. Social media campaigns can focus on key issues. The other thing I was going to add around is youth delegation, but as Vicky mentioned, on those international things, sometimes they happen a much more organic or way, not a very formal way, but WAGE, for example, funds a delegation to the UNCSW every year. Last year's delegation was comprised of only youth members. We had decided to focus on youth given our minister's double mandate. She's also responsible for youth. And of course, there's these other formal ways that I feel like I might bore you with, but there's like the Prime Minister's Youth Council, and there's engagement with the national and provincial consultations. Like governments often hold engagements on gender equality policies, so youth can engage in these consultations, contributing their perspective on the implementation of BFIA at the national as well as provincial levels. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And I think that like you've already kind of touched on the fact that like CSW is a way to get engaged, but it's not the only way to get engaged. OCIC does send a delegation every year. So we're wondering if there's any advice that you have for them on how to meaningfully engage with the CSW process, as they'll be lucky enough to be on the ground for that in March.
Well, do you want me to start, Marjorie? Okay. Well, there's lots of ways that you can engage. This year will be different because it is a review year. There isn't going to be a negotiated outcome document in the same way as there is when we have a priority theme, where there are negotiations that sort of happen mostly in the second week of the CSW, and it's all very dramatic and super fun if you're geeky like I am. But this year, there will be a sort of shorter, more focused political declaration, which will be negotiated in advance and adopted at the on the first or second day of the CSW. This happens every time there's a review year, and so it does afford fewer opportunities to kind of get into that. However, there are still lots of other ways to get involved. So I do encourage folks to join the Beijing Network is a network of organizations. I think OCIC is already in there, but keeping abreast of those opportunities. We will be doing some more engagement because of the funding, thanks to WAGE. We are going to be kind of holding some conversations, including an in-person meeting in January, and we're going to be doing some follow-up as well. So keep your eyes on that. And I don't know, Marjorie, if you're planning on having a rapid response team this year for the political declaration negotiations. So she'll tell you about that. There are going to be negotiations this year on the working methods and the next 5 themes. So if you have ideas about what the priority themes should be, this now is the time that you should let the government know, we'd really like to see the CSW focus on this. Because that is going to be negotiated. And the working methods, well, the last time we negotiated working methods, it got pretty interesting because the role of civil society at the CSW, where space for civil society in there has been shrinking over the years, to the point where, we're not allowed to observe negotiations. We're sort of kept out of the room on the sidelines, and this is very unique to UN discussions, where usually civil society can be in the room to observe and interact with their governments, not to speak, but to be there. So that was a sort of a hot topic. It'll be a hot topic again this year. The other layer, which I'm hoping also Marjorie might be able to address, is that because there is a sort of very large scale overhauling going on within the multilateral institutions at the moment, there is a process that is being led by ECOSOC, which is chaired by Canada right now. So Bob Ray is leading this process until June, I think, or July, to revitalize the CSW. What this is going to look like, what this means, is kind of up for question right now. There have been some preliminary discussions among some civil society groups about what we would like to see, but it hasn't really gotten concrete because we don't know what the process is going to be. So once we know what the process is going to be, then we're going to have some engagement within Canadian civil society to figure out what we think we would like. So that is another way, that opportunity that you will have to get involved through the Beijing network. We'll be engaging people on that. And I will say that, yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but maybe there'll be some other ways to make some of the points that I want to make later on.
This will be my third UNCSW, and what I have found is that conversations that happen on the cusp of all of these meetings is the most important. So using your voices and using your network is very important. Build relationships with other CSOs, and you have Vicky here who can provide you, who can connect you with a network of CSOs, which I think is very important. Attend side events, whether in person or virtually. Also find ways to engage in the political declaration for UNCSW 69. As Vicky mentioned, this year, again, we will have the rapid response team. This will be happening in January and February as the political declaration is negotiated ahead of time. What the rapid response team is, I don't know why I don't know who came up with that name, but basically it just means that you have to respond really quickly, and these emails come really quickly from your team, and it's our way to engage with civil society on the political documents. So it's very important for this organization to get that name on their list. Last but not least, and this may sound a little bit lame, but bring your business cards and use your voices. There are officials there. There are government officials. There are political officials, ministers, cabinet ministers, parliamentarians, senators, and they are all there to hear your voices. So please don't be shy. Reach out. Tell them what you've heard at the UNCSW and what your priorities are and what you'd like to see. And in terms of your last question, Vicky, your thing around the process for revitalization, I don't have that. I actually don't have the answer to that, but we do have a meeting with the mission next week, so hopefully we'll have more information.
I should also add, and I can't believe I forgot to say this like right at the beginning, that there is a young feminist caucus at the CSW. Are any of you involved in it yet, or? Because so it's a very informal network. It is progressive in that it is pretty sure that it has a set of values that you have to sign on to, which includes trans inclusion, for example, and acknowledgement of sex work as work. Which is often a dividing line between generations at the CSW, I will say, but not just generations. And so if you're interested and you're not involved, I can put one of you in touch with them. It's not like necessarily everybody joins. I think that it's organizationally based, but I can certainly connect you with the right people if you want to get involved in that. And I have found these global networks to be the most useful space to learn to engage and to get like more deeply involved. And my first couple of years at the CSW, I was going to the regional caucus. I was not feeling like it was a useful or strategic space. And I was a bit frustrated. We did have a good relationship with the government. So one-on-one, we would, have our discussions in the hallways and stuff. And it wasn't until like my third or fourth time there that I ran into the Women's Rights Caucus, which is a very loose and informal network of progressive feminists, and which was just so much more useful because it was largely people who were younger, people who were coming from the global south. Like it was just a different type of space than I was used to. So finding those different types of networks where people kind of gather and collaborate at the CSW can really help deepen your experience there and connect you with some really amazing people.
That's super great. Thank you both like so much. That was like a super detailed answer. So it was great to hear about those things. And I'm sure we'll ask Pragya to follow up on the Young Feminist Caucus because that sounds really interesting. My last question for both of you before I open it up to the crowd is essentially like about what happens after CSW. So how can we bring back the learnings from CSW, which this year is about the commemoration of, 30 years of the BPfA? How can we bring that back to like our local community, and why is there a need to do so? And either one of you can take that.
Do you want me to go first,
start?
Vicky?
Yeah, you
sure.
Go. We're like playing chicken here.
It's a really good question. Thank you for your question. And it's something that we struggle with too within because you get to the UNCSW, there's an excitement in the air and there's a certain level of urgency you feel like, and then what happens when you get back? So thank you for your question. First, by fostering education, dialogue, and advocacy at the grassroots level, communities and that can contribute to the broader global movement. And I think Vicky can speak to more about advocating at the grassroots level, sharing what you've learned with others in your network. So workshops, things like this are so important. Youth groups, reporting back to global, local organization, social media campaigns. I'm trying to, like within the government of Canada, trying to find a way that we can better use our digital voice to promote these messages. Engaging, of course, with local and national level policymakers to ensure that the recognition of CSW are implemented in a domestic policy. Again, you've got a mentor here in Vicky who does a very good job at that. Yeah, it's proposed. I'm looking at my notes. I have proposing new programs that address issues like women's economic empowerment, violence prevention, and access to healthcare inspired by CSW discussions. I'll now turn it to Vicky. You're still on mute.
Sorry about that. There's a couple of different, like I say, BPfA is a very aspirational document. It's not the only thing that Canada is sort of like the only international treaty related to gender equality, right? We also have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We're hopeful that the government of Canada will sign on to the Inter-Americas Treaty, the Bellum de Para Convention on violence. There are a raft of international labor organization standards and so on. And really it is about, and one of the ways that we can collaborate, right, as feminist civil society is understanding what are the international obligations and how do we see that playing out here? Like, what does it mean in a Canadian context? As Marjorie pointed out, we're a federated state, right? So there's 13 jurisdictions that you have to keep an eye out, different different jurisdictions are responsible for different things. So really knowing and understanding that, being active at every level of government is really important. So, municipalities are spaces where you can really help to advocate for really concrete changes to make people's lives better. The provinces are responsible for a lot of the kind of social programs, services, and supports that people rely on, and so on. So, just being sort of politically involved and engaged is about that. And if you do that through the lens of, okay, what are we actually supposed to be doing? Like, what can we hold Canada accountable for is really important. Now, the BPfA isn't necessarily binding, right? So, it's not like, the review is an interesting exercise in self-reflection, but there's no consequences, right, necessarily for not implementing it. CEDAW is a different kind of matter in that when there is a review, that, Canada has to actually directly answer questions, which is something that they just went through with the review of CEDAW. And then there are very specific recommendations that are issued by the committee members. And those are things to pay attention to also, right? So that's why coalitions are really important at the domestic level, because no organization is able to kind of keep a handle on everything, right? We each have our different areas of expertise. And gender equality is like, it's like whack-a-mole. If you think you've got one thing covered, up pops another barrier somewhere else, right? So you really do need to be working collaboratively. And so being part of feminist civil society means working with other organizations on figuring out where you think you might be able to move the bar with whatever government is elected, at prioritizing and strategizing and really sort of breaking it off into achievable chunks, right? And as civil society, I mean, we're coming up on another election, so feminist groups are collaborating right now with a view to trying to ensure that some of the issues are really important that are raised in the election. Some of our priorities are dealt with in the public discourse. And then afterwards, we'll take stock depending on what the results of the election are and figure out a plan to influence the new government. That's, yeah, it's just what we do.
Great. Thank you so much. All of your answers have been super, super informative for me, and I'm sure everyone else as well. And there's definitely a few things that I want to start to tackle now that I've learned all these things from you. I'll pass it on to the group. I know we're at 7:04 now, but just if anybody has any like burning questions that they'd like to ask Marjorie and Vicky while we have them here, please feel free to pop up your hand and unmute.
Maybe I'll ask a question. So I was wondering maybe which provinces or territories have best addressed the BPfA, like the areas of concern and why, like what kind of mechanisms are enabling them to do so compared to other provinces?
It's pretty interesting. I would say, like, it really depends. Quebec definitely has had a very long consensus around having a sort of robust set of social supports. And they've had some really actively feminist governments in the past that have brought in some fairly significant change. So their childcare system, for example, is a model for what we're trying to achieve now in the rest of Canada. They were the first to adopt proactive pay equity legislation, and I would say have done a pretty good job on that. Ontario also, depending on who's in office, right, has been able to make some progress on a number of other things as well. BC for sure. Manitoba, like it really depends, you know, and the thing is, it really depends on who's in power. Like like elections really do matter. And so if we elect feminist governments, we get feminist policy, right? If you have but it doesn't take that long to dismantle it, you know, like so you know, which is why we have the housing crisis that we have right now. So yeah, like I would say no province is like, you know, the winner. I will say that there's probably strengths in several provinces around areas like pay equity, like violence maybe, and so on, but there's definitely a lot of work that we have to do.
I got caught to the mute, no mute button. Great. Thanks so much for that. And I think that that is a really effective and I think point that resonates with all of us. You elect feminist governments, you get feminist policy. And I think that's something that we're going to keep in mind as we kind of do our advocacy. I see Ms. Scott's hands up. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you again to both of our speakers. I guess the question I had was specifically internationally. I know that Canada does have, like as we've talked today, has a feminist policy. However, most governments abroad may not agree with this policy itself. And from the news, and again, every news article is very biased, but specifically through one of my research essays, I was focusing on different countries that may think that Canada's policy specifically on feminism or gender equality is quote unquote extremely socialist policy. And so my question, I guess, to both the speakers is when it comes to like international cooperation, especially those Canada trying to, as right now we're seeing, they're trying to have more economic ties with other countries. Do you think that they should have a very specific gender equality policy, or should it be more broader focus where it has more intersectional lens of other areas that they can kind of bring into this feminist policy itself, especially as a middle power and relying heavily on economic trade and I guess cooperation with countries that don't, I guess, deem gender equality as important. Not that I say that I'm obviously on this call, I'm very supportive of gender equality. I guess it's just me learning about it from the other perspective as well. I don't know if I phrased that properly, so feel free to let me know if I should phrase that a different way.
I'm not sure if I completely understood the question. So maybe, Vicky, do you have?
I'll take a stab at it.
And then I'll.
Like multilateralism is hard. Negotiations is hard. Trade negotiations is hard. It really depends. There is no, like when you are working with other countries, you do have to sometimes meet them where they are, right? And there is definitely, depending on which country, right? But if you're, say, working with the global south, for example, on a trade negotiation or on something else, imposing your, you know, like your version of feminism, you know, may be seen as perceived as an act of colonialism. And that is not going to help anybody, right? That being said, there's lots of ways of, there's lots of things we can learn from countries in the global south as well that we actually are not doing a very good job on. So I would say that, like, just because you call something feminist doesn't necessarily mean it always is, right? So the whole, I think what I've learned through my international work is just how, you know, the challenges that exist for women and gender diverse people, the systemic barriers and really the crises are pretty universal, right? There is like, you know, the epidemic of gender-based violence and femicide is universal, right? The gender wage gap, universal, right? Barriers to women in work, universal. So while there might be some disagreement over, like with some governments that actually don't really care about that stuff at all, like we may not be working with them very much. Like, should we be working with Hungary right now? No, right? We should not. So Canada does do a good job of connecting with like-mindeds, but sometimes you have to, if you're trying to further something, bring your values to the table and find a way to work it in a way that meets groups where they're at. And I learned that lesson mostly when I was involved at the International Labor Organization in negotiating the Violence and Harassment Convention, because it was very interesting. Like, we had definitely an idea in our heads that we wanted to we wanted a really progressive feminist and we had to compromise on language in order to bring some of the more conservative states to the table. And that meant we couldn't refer directly to 2S LGBTQI people, right? And in fact, but I will say that what happened is we worked closely with queer organizations globally, right, on what would be the best language to achieve the same results. So you just sometimes need to find really creative ways, right? And to remember that the point here is to build consensus and to move the bar. And we ended up, after those negotiations, with, I think, what is one of the most feminist instruments out there right now. But that was 5 years ago. And it is a different world now. We have a lot more authoritarian governments. We have a very well-funded, very powerful, very influential anti-gender, anti-rights movement that is sort of woven in with other types of, I would say, I'm going to say fascist movements, right? And it is exerting incredible influence and power globally. And that means that what comes along with that is a real contempt for multilateralism, which is sort of playing out, and you'll see it play out when you go to the CSW this year, and it's playing out in a lot of different spaces. And that is where like-minded states, so Canada and its allies, really need to sit down and think very hard about how to best go about this. And to me, it's about saving multilateral institutions and playing the long game. They are much better at playing the long game than we are. And I will say that the authoritarian, conservative, and fundamentalist states have controlled the narrative at the CSW for many years. And they do that because they can do it behind closed doors, because we're not there to witness it. I think that makes it worse. But we, as feminist movements, as gender equality champions, really need to start to have very serious conversations. I don't think it is necessarily about compromising our principles or focusing on something more broad. I think we still have to acknowledge that gender equality is an economic driver, right? And so if we don't pay attention to it, we do it at our peril, right? And the economy's peril as well. And I think the pandemic showed us that. So we do have a lot of work to do, but we are up against something that is pretty scary. And but we don't mourn and write, we organize, and that's what we're going to try and do. And so that's why these global networks of feminist organizations are so important.
Did you mind if I ask one more question, Catherine, if that's okay?
Yeah,
Okay,
for sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Vicky. You said that perfectly, and apologies, I could have also worded that question a bit more differently as well. I guess my other question, just to follow up with that, is you mentioned about conservatives and authoritarian governments that are kind of uprising. In regards to that, especially as we approach a federal election as well, and with the Conservative Party that has certain narratives, and I don't completely know them because I haven't done my full research on that, but just with your knowledge and experience, where do you think the Feminist International Policy that was brought in by Trudeau will go towards? And the second question to that is, where do you think if the Conservative Party does come into power, where does kind of gender equality also stand as well there?
Marjorie, would you like me to answer that?
I cannot answer that one. So yes, please,
Yeah.
Vicky, go ahead.
Okay, so look, we just have to look back a few years to the Harper government to see, what it's going to be like when it comes to their international assistance policies. It was very targeted to the business interests of Canadian corporations. So there was a lot of public-private partnerships, which are very harmful for women, especially as they are as they play out in the global South as a development strategy, right? So that and then they had their big thing that they did was they had a maternal and child health initiative, which was kind of their flagship initiative. They created a Canadian organization which essentially undermined a lot of the sexual and reproductive health and rights organizations that already existed. Abortion was not part of the, part of the conclusion, but they found a way to do something. Just like actually they did do a few things. They signed on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, for example. Like they will find things that they are interested in, and they'll pursue those things. And that's where we have to sort of see, okay, where can we work strategically with this government to sort of move the bar? Though this Conservative Party is not interested in multilateralism at all, right? They perpetuate conspiracy theories about various UN institutions. So I don't know where it's gonna go, right? I will say though that, like, regardless, no matter who's in power, we have really good people working in the government that we can work with, and that is basically what we will be doing. Is we will be sort of figuring out where we can have the most influence, where we might be able to find some common interests or common priorities with that government, and work with other governments maybe on the other things that we are interested in.
Thank you so much. And I think that we're unfortunately winding down in terms of the time that we've got. So maybe I'll pass it to Mazda for the closing, but I just want to thanks so much for your answers. They were like really illuminating, and I think have given us a lot of places to start, which is really exciting.
Yeah, so hello everyone, this is Mushta, and I also wanted to thank you so much, Vicky and Marjorie, for your insights and expertise. It's been such an honor and pleasure to learn from you. I will, and I am sure our participants will continue to reflect on today's discussion. I would like to also thank the YPH members, Mickey, Celine, Aisha, Rida, Katrina, and also the OCIC members for all the efforts in making this session a success. With this, we close out today's session and invite you all for our final Policy Matters session happening in January 2025. More details about the date and timing of the session will be available closer to the session on our website and social media. You can also sign up for our newsletter through the website to learn more about the upcoming events and also the session. Also, sorry for the voice that was coming here, but wish you all a good night and thank you so much once again.